This episode is with Matthew Fanuka, a PhD student at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Anthropology. Matthew is also a graduate teaching assistant and robotics and engineering educator. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, well, so first of all, thank you for being here. I appreciate you making time.
Yeah.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I just got off work, worked 8 hours. Now I'm here. I'm just chilling. I'm just trying to enjoy the few hours that I got before I have to go to sleep and then go back to work the next day.
Yeah. What are you working right now?
So right now I work at I'm in education currently. Right now I work at this place. It's called Anthropology. It's a big franchise. It's not actually that big. But we mainly teach like STEM, mainly like robotics and engineering to kids that are in like middle and elementary school. So those are my days now, especially during the summer.
Is it a school or is it kind of like
it's like an extracurricular program. So we run a lot of camps during the summer, but we have classes and stuff and like workshops and all that.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a good job. Cool. Just kids are exhausting.
Yeah, I bet it. I mean, does it go during the school year as well, or just during the summer?
Yeah, it goes during the school year too, but then we focus more on like doing classes with kids and stuff as opposed to like camps. Like maybe actually try and teach them something instead of just like, hey, have fun, don't break anything.
Yeah. So you said it's robotics and engineering. What kind of things do you guys do? Do you build some stuff?
Yeah, we do pretty much everything that we have with Legos. So like there's these big like Lego like engineering kits that have like all these robotic parts in them. And the kids just like go crazy with them. It's fun.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. I think when you're young, a lot of the times a lot of kids like to, well, I always liked Legos, and I always found robotics and engineering kind of like just cars in general.
Yeah, for sure, right?
Stuff like that. You really enjoy.
There's always something that a kid's into where you could just grab them and be like, hey, what about this? This is cool. And then it just like opens up a whole new set of doors for them.
Yeah. You mentioned to me that you wanted to transition over to education. What's your plan? We can talk about what you did before a little bit later on, but what's your plan going forward? Is that something you want to keep focusing on?
For sure. So it's kind of hard to talk about it without talking about the past, but I kind of realized that like I just love to teach. I mean, I love talking. I love like communicating information. I love like if I knew when I was going into PhD programs that science communicator was one that you could do, I probably would have ended up doing that. I didn't, obviously, but just like working with this stuff and also with like, students, just having students and like being a teacher. And like, I love that moment when you're like talking to someone. And this has happened like all throughout, when I'm like in like the lab, like TAing for like undergrad classes, down to like working with like kindergartners. Like there's a moment where they're like, oh, like, and they finally get something that they were struggling with. I love that. I live for that moment. So it's things like that. Also just feeling like, there's no question about whether or not you're putting like positive energy or like whatever out into the world when you're like teaching. But if you're sitting, in a lab or like in an office for like 8 hours a day, just working, writing, and doing whatever, like you think, right? Like you start to question like how much, like value am I putting out into the world? Am I doing what I want to do, what I feel like I was put here to do? So that's kind of where I'm planning on going in the future. Keep, continuing to teach, being a teacher. Like ideally, I would love to teach in a high school. We'll get there someday. It's like a science teacher. My fiance is from Spain, so we're gonna move there probably around at the end of this year. And so hopefully I'll be able to like settle down a little more and like kind of find a job over there once we like, get everything situated.
Do you speak Spanish?
Yeah, I do speak Spanish.
Okay.
You have to, because the Spaniards are not very good at speaking English.
Yeah. It's a whole different, not only language, but moving over there, it's a big cultural change as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I've been over a bunch. Like as an archaeologist, you do a ton of traveling. And like the first excavation that I ever did was in Spain. So like I've been familiar with the country for a while. I just got really lucky to like fall in love with the Spaniard, be able to
Yeah.
go and like live there.
Where in Spain are you looking to move?
Barcelona, that's where she's from.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never been to Spain. I've been to other parts of Europe. But I've heard that Spain is a really beautiful country, and I've heard that it's a
Gorgeous.
very kind of like party oriented culture.
Yeah, it is. If you're into that thing, if you're into what they like to do over there is they'll like, I think the last time I went out to like a club in Spain, which was like years ago, I'm too old for that anymore. But the last time I did, like, it's like 10 o'clock and we're like sitting around, just like me, my fiance, like my girlfriend at the time, and like, just a couple other people, and we're just like sitting around having a couple beers. It's 10 o'clock. Okay, maybe we'll go soon. 11 o'clock. Okay, maybe we'll go soon. 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock. And then 1:30 rolls around and they're like, okay, now we're gonna go to the club. And then you go and then you stay there until like 6:30 in the morning. Like if you're into that kind of stuff, yeah, Spain is the place for you.
Yeah, I've heard I heard that their eating schedule is very different to like what they
Oh,
do,
it's
for example, in
wild.
America
Sometimes we'll sit
because of
down and
this.
eat dinner at like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah, and the restaurants are open super late, and
Yeah.
they're not open early in the morning, stuff like that, right?
They got siesta, so a lot of places will close at like, 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon and stay closed for a few hours because siesta is just such a big part of the lifestyle over there.
Okay, right. Do you like Barcelona? You've been there before, I assume.
I've been there a million times. Yeah, I
Okay.
love the city. I mean, it's seriously one of the most gorgeous cities that I've ever been to. Like, it's yeah, the architecture of the place is just absolutely stunning. So, yeah,
Yeah, I have some friends that live in Spain, and I've been curious to not only to want to visit, but maybe at some point just looking into living there or in some other part of
for
Europe.
sure. Yeah, you
What
should
what do
totally
you
go and check it out.
what do you like most about it? You said the architecture, but if you could like go into a little more detail.
Yeah, for sure. So, like, they have like a bunch of different architectural styles all over Barcelona. Like, this is the thing that a lot of Americans kind of have a hard time conceptualizing about Europe, especially if they've never been there, is that like American history goes back like 400 years, 500 years, maybe tops, if you can even count like that early stuff as American history, right? Like European history goes back thousands, literally thousands. People have been living in Barcelona for a very, very, very long time. And so like you have those layers of history. And so like in one neighborhood, one of my favorite neighborhoods, the Gothic neighborhood, and that was all built like, I think around like medieval times. So like maybe like the 12th century. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Spanish history. But then you also have stuff that was built like this year, or like you might know like the really famous building in Spain, the Sagrada Familia, like the big like giant chapel that's there. And it's always under construction because the guy, Gaudi, who designed it, he designed a lot of really famous buildings in Spain, died before they finished it. It's actually a weird story how he died. He was like the super famous like builder in Spain, and he got hit by like a bus or something one day, and people thought he was homeless, so they didn't help him. This is what my fiance says, if she's to be trusted. But I thought he was homeless, so they didn't trust him or like go help him. And then he died before they could finish building the building. So it's still under construction. So like they still, you've got all of these layers of like history. Each neighborhood has like different like architectural themes and everything. Even buildings within neighborhoods are different. Yeah, that's something that makes it like, you walk from one place to another in Spain, like keeps it super fresh. It's not like you're walking around like, Manhattan, for example, and like a lot of the places, a lot of the blocks that you'll go to in neighborhoods look very samey, look very similar, at least in terms of like how the buildings are built, how the city is designed and set up. But yeah, in Barcelona, it's definitely a lot different.
Yeah. So one part that very much draws you in is the historical aspect of it.
Yeah, definitely,
Okay.
definitely.
And I guess I mean it makes sense. We can use that to kind of transition to your first excursion over there, your archaeological digging site, and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
what did you used to do, and how did you get into that?
for sure. So way back when, I don't even want to think how many years ago now at this point. I was in community college and I was like super interested in pre-med. I was going, gonna because community colleges operate on like a 2-year degree thing, right? And so like you go and like you kind of figure out what you're doing and then you'll transfer to like another school. So I was going to transfer to another school for pre-med because I wanted to be a doctor. Then I took one anthropology course just as like a prerequisite for the degree at the community college, and I just like fell in love with it because archaeology in the US is lumped under anthropology. So anthropology's got four different subfields. There's archaeology, linguistics, cultural anthropology, and biological anthropology. And so archaeology is like under this umbrella of anthropology, which is like the study of humans, right? Literally anthro, humans, and then pology, the study of. And so I grew up in New Jersey, and I went to Rutgers University after community college, got a degree in evolutionary anthropology, and then, like very quickly realized that like the culture around like anthropology and like archaeology as an undergrad is that you are, not expected to, but kind of pushed towards grad school because there's not really many jobs for somebody who has a degree in like a bachelor's of science in evolutionary anthropology. Like it's nice to have a bachelor's of science, because like, a lot of people are getting BAs. But yeah, there's not much to do with just the bachelor's. And so like you go into grad school. And so now I'm here at the University of Minnesota. I applied, and then started coming here in the fall of 2018. I went to my first excavation through Rutgers, through somebody that I knew at Rutgers, my undergrad advisor there, knew some people, and me and like another dude that were undergrads there went for 6 weeks in like southeast Spain, in like the Alicante region. And we were excavating a site. It was from a period called the Middle Paleolithic, and this is like the specific site that we were at. Like the Middle Paleolithic was stretched from like 200,000 years ago until like 45,000 years ago. The site that we were working at was at the tail end of that, so it was probably like 45, like 50,000 years ago. And these numbers will change depending on who you ask. And yeah, it was mainly occupied by Neanderthals at the time. Like the world definitely looked like a much different place. Like one of the cool things that we found on like the Spanish mountain was a rhino tooth, which is like, whoa, like what are rhinos doing in Spain? But like they just lived, kind of all over back then, in like this period of geological history called the Pleistocene, right? And so yeah, that's kind of how I like got into it. And then as a grad student, you just like that becomes your entire life, and it just becomes more and more and more. So it just picks up the pace from there.
Yeah. What was your schedule like as a grad student studying this?
Yeah,
More or
for
less.
sure. It depends on the time of year, and that's another
Okay.
one of the reasons why like I'm trying to get out of archaeology is because like it's very inconsistent with how your time goes. Like during the school year, I was at the beginning of your degree, you'll be taking classes and stuff, and also generally you'll be TAing like for a lab or like a discussion section or something like that at the same time to make like money. Also getting teaching experience. But yeah, so you'll be TAing and like doing classes, like all these departmental events, all of these like bureaucratic things with these like very smart people. And then during the summer, it's really up in the air. Like I think 3 summers ago it was like a little bit, maybe a summer or two before COVID really hit. I ended up taking like 14 or 15 flights in one summer because I was just doing like field schools and excavations and like visiting people and all of this stuff. So yeah, it's really hard to say like what the average day of an archaeologist is like during the summer because you're all over the place. I mean, it's really inconsistent. You're like often in these places way out in the middle of nowhere, like no, cell reception, no internet or anything like that. Like at some of the excavations that I was at, you were lucky if there's electricity, right? And you're there for a long period of time with a small group of people. So it's not very conducive towards having a family, which is like
Yeah.
something that I want to do. So yeah.
Right. And it's odd. I always figured that when it comes to these, I guess PhD programs, you mentioned at the beginning that one of the reasons you transitioned or you want to transition out of it is because you didn't really want to be stuck on like an office all day or on a work setting all day. I would imagine that with these fields or with this particular field, you wouldn't be necessarily stuck in an office, but rather out outside, doing physical
Yeah,
things.
and it really depends on what you do. So like there's two big things that archaeologists really do after they are done with their degree and want to go into the workforce. So if you're talking about in the US, there's cultural resource management, or CRM for short. And that employs 50% of the archaeologists in the US. And basically what happens is every time that there is a construction project on federal land that requires federal permits or that uses federal dollars, there has to be an archaeologist there, because even though American history goes back, only a few hundred years, there are thousands of years of history even before that, right? And so if you're digging, for a construction project somewhere, maybe you're building a highway, like highways all have archaeologists on them when they're doing it. They'll do a survey. They might even do like a couple test pits, which is where you dig like a 1 meter by 1 meter or even smaller square, typically a meter down, so like meter, so that you can see if there's anything there. You're not going to do that if you don't suspect that there's going to be something there. Generally it's to, you think that there's a lot of like artifacts or something in that area, or like bones or something like that, and so you'll go in and you'll dig like this big hole just to see. But on all of these projects, they have to have an archaeologist there because they might find something. So that employs about half of the archaeologists. Then the other half either don't go into archaeology like myself, or they end up going into academia. And there is where you're going to do a lot of writing and a lot of lab work. And so once you're out of grad school, or really once you're done with your coursework and working on your own research for your own thesis or dissertation, you'll go into the field, collect data, collect artifacts, or whatever the hell like you're going to be analyzing. Could be literally anything. Like my specific brand of archaeology was called microarchaeology, and so like it's all about archaeology of stuff that's really, 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 really small. And so like my original thesis project was I was going to look at like ancient preserved proteins on stone tools, right, to see if we could recover some of these proteins that the tools, from the things that the tools were used to cut, in order to say like what they were actually being used for. Because it's really difficult, to just pick up a stone tool. And I have a couple. I should have brought some over so I could show you. But it's really difficult to pick one of these things up and know what it was used for, because they were so general, like you make them as you need them. People made them in the past as they needed them and used them as they needed them as well. And so methods like that are something that a lot of archaeologists will do. These like, crazy methods where you would never like think of it, but it can help learn something. But you'll go into the field, gather all of those things, and then throughout like the year, fall, winter, and spring, be in the lab analyzing these, or be sitting down writing and trying to get a paper published, or just working on, whatever you're working on at the time. So it really depends on what you're doing. Also, like what time period you're working in, what part of the world you're working in, how big the team you're working on is with, what like your role in that team is, right? Because none of this happens like by any one person's self. You always need multiple levels of people working on any given excavation in order to make it happen. So yeah, that's where you can get a lot of like the office work and like the writing and stuff. I loved the excavating. Like the excavating is fun. I get a little like emotional towards the end of the excavation. Like you're stuck out in the field for like 6 weeks. Like everyone starts to go a little crazy.
Yeah.
That's when the most drama happens, at the end of a field season, for that reason in particular. But it was like all the other stuff where, I do prefer to be out there and moving and active and like all of these things. And I think that's part of what was so attractive to me about teaching, was that like you can do that in a classroom while still engaging with a lot of like interesting materials. Whereas like as an archaeologist, like, maybe 10 weeks out of the year, I'm doing awesome stuff and going around traveling the world for free, like doing all of these crazy things. And then the other like 40 something weeks of the year, you're just sitting and doing a lot of reading, a lot of writing. Yeah.
Right. Out of the places that you went to do excavations aside from Spain, which
Yeah.
other ones did you go to?
Yeah, so I've been to a bunch. I have been to multiple in Spain. I went to Ethiopia for an excavation over there, and that was a wild experience. I mean, that was the most remote that I've ever been. We were like on the edge of the Sahara, right next to this river that was like a tributary to the Nile. Because the whole thing is like, you're not just excavating to find artifacts, right? There's multiple levels. So there's like high level theory, mid level theory, low level theory. And so like your, low level theory might be like, I think there are artifacts here, or I think there are this kind of artifacts here, right? Your like high level theory, by contrast, will be like humans were using these sites as like, or humans were settling sites along this route to try and like, so like the theory for this project was that they were settling sites along tributaries of the Nile, and that's how humans left Africa, found their way out of Africa, because we evolved there, right? But eventually we left, but it wasn't immediate. And so there's this giant and there's not many ways out, right? Like there are two major ways that you could leave. One is across like through Egypt into the Middle East, and then one is across the Red Sea into Arabia, and like modern day Yemen is the closest point of contact between Africa and what is technically Asia, right? So that would be like the high level hypothesis. And so like you're doing this excavation, you're finding all these cool things, but it's always to remember, like we do everything as anthropologists. It's not because like we're archaeologists and we just like to dig and like look at old cool materials. Like it's because you're trying to learn something about humans, or human history, human nature, human psychology, whatever. And so yeah, that was a really cool site, but we were super remote because like the hypothesis was, low level, we think humans were living here for a little bit. High level, we think humans were living here because they were traveling up the Nile without even knowing it and accidentally found their way out of Africa. So yeah, I did that excavation in Ethiopia. I've done excavations in Greece. I've done a lot of excavations in Montenegro, which is like this tiny country right across the Adriatic Sea from Italy. It's like ex-Yugoslavia. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous country. Another like cool Neanderthal site that we were working on there. I've done excavations in Israel. I'm probably forgetting one or two, but those were the ones that were like, yeah, the most important.
Right. I would imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that when you go to these different sites, you find different things in each of them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
What kind of things do you find in which settings?
Yeah, definitely. So like it really depends. It's when you're thinking about archaeology, it's never a question just about like where, and it's always a question about where and when, right? So like I can look at like two sites at the exact same place in Spain, right? Like I can look at like one site which maybe is 4, we'll say, meters down from like the surface, right? You dig down 4 meters, you have one area that has all these artifacts in them, and they're going to be more recent because the stuff that's on the top is deposited more recently than the stuff that's on the bottom. So the stuff that's on the bottom in archaeology is always older. It's called the law of superposition. It's actually a geological law, but archaeologists have kind of co-opted it, and it works the same way with artifacts unless they've been moved after they were deposited into the ground. And so yeah, you can go down 4 meters, find one set of artifacts, and then you can go down another 4 meters, and then all of a sudden be thousands of years into the past, like previous from the other layers that you were excavating, and have a completely different set of materials. So, for example, when I was working in Israel, it was at this site. I forget actually what it was called. It was a tell, which is in archaeology, a tell is where people have been settling for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And over time, dirt accumulates over old structures and people build new structures on top of them, and you get this big hill. And so you excavate down through the hill and you find these different layers of artifacts that as you get closer to the base of the hill, get older. And not the base of the hill, but the center of the hill, right? And so we're at this site, and over there, people might be finding like, there was this one incident where like somebody found like actually I think it was a dog who was like digging in the ground, and then people decided to dig there, but they found like a crusader sword, or like the hilt of a crusader sword, which is from like I think the Crusades started in like the 12th century, maybe the 11th century or something like that. But then, and that would just be over there. But then over here where I'm excavating, we're finding nothing but stone tools, maybe some pottery from like 2,000 years ago, so a whole 1,000 years earlier than what they're excavating over there. So it's always a question of where and when are you excavating. Um,
Okay.
but even if you're just if you're looking at the same time period, same things, like say I was looking at stone tools, for example, and I'm going to compare an assemblage of stone tools that I have in Spain from like, 60,000 years ago to a site in like Africa from 60,000 years ago. You're going to find pretty much only stone tools. Maybe you'll find some bones and stuff, but those aren't technically artifacts. Like an artifact, quote unquote, in the traditional sense, is just something that humans have made, right? So like a human bone is not necessarily an artifact unless somebody picked it up and did something with it. So you'll find pretty much only stone tools at those sites, but they're going to be wildly different because there are thousands of miles of geographical space separating those people who have developed like different cultural traditions about how to make and how to use and how to like process stone tools, where to get the raw material from these things. And so they're all going to look different, right? And so like an expert will be able to like look at a bunch of stone tools together and be able to tell you like, okay, these are probably from here around this period of time, these are probably from here around this period of time, right? Things definitely get more complicated when you move further up into, or I guess more recent in time, as people started to invent more technologies, and then obviously deposit, you create these things, use them, and then deposit them into the ground at some point in their life, whatever, before they die, and then are themselves then deposited into the ground for us to find thousands of years later. But yeah, the things get more complicated as I don't want to say more complicated, but there's a wider variety of things that you can look at as you get more recent in past.
Right. When contrasting, say, the site that you excavated in Ethiopia, but then contrasting that with Greece and then contrasting that with Israel, the temperatures and the climates and the regions, they're vastly different in each of them. What kind of differences have you seen with the tools that you found or with the things that you found?
Yeah, for sure. So the site that I was excavating in Greece was in Athens. That was the Athenian Agora, which was just like a big gathering place for people in like ancient Greece around 2,000 years ago. And so there, the main artifact of the site, I would say, was actually the site itself. Like we were surrounded by tons of like architecture, tons of these old things, right? But mainly structures. And so a lot of what we did was go and literally look at the structures and like the dirt that was keeping the structures in there to see if we could figure out what has happened geologically throughout the history of this site. So that's what we'll look at in that site. When I was in Israel, it was more of like a biblical age thing. So actually probably around the same time period as maybe a little bit later than the Greek or the site that I was working at in Greece. But there we were finding a lot of stone tools. We were finding a lot of pottery pieces, and that's something that pops up all over the place. Once you get to like the Bronze Age, is just a ton of pottery, because like somebody makes a pot and then the pot breaks, and then all of a sudden you have these pot shards, or potsherds as they're called in archaeology, and they just get thrown onto the ground. There's these giant assemblages of things that are thrown away, which is called a midden. And that's basically just like a giant landfill. And so you'll find these giant middens that have these like pieces of pottery on them. And then you can look at those pieces of pottery and analyze what kind of technologies they were looking at. So like one of the really cool things that we were finding in Israel was like at one point, they have a bunch of pottery that looks like it was made with one method where you take a bunch of clay and you roll it into like little snakes, and then you make circles out of those and then join them together in the shape of the pot. And you can tell that just by looking at it if you're really good at it. But then we would also find different kinds of pottery that use different technologies, where you can see these lines on the inside of the pot, and that was from a potter's wheel. And so you can literally see the invention of a potter's wheel happening as you dig down in this site, or I guess like as the artifacts rise up in the site, because the potter's wheel was invented at like one point, and then after that, like all of the pottery is made on the potter's wheel because it's much faster and less like time and energy demanding than like wrapping cords around themselves, right? And so that's what we'd find there. But then we're in like Ethiopia, and now we're looking at a site that's probably 90 to 100,000 years old. And so the most exciting thing that we're finding there is like fish bones or like bison bones. But to that hypothesis, that makes a lot of sense. And so like you want to be finding a lot of fish bones at this site where your hypothesis is, I think they were traveling up the river and using river resources to like, guide them almost out of Africa without them knowing that they were being guided out of Africa. You want to be finding a lot of these boring things, these fish bones, because it means that they were using resources from the river that was, nearby. And this is before the invention of the fish hook and like the, maybe they had nets and something like that. Those things are not going to preserve over thousands of years, like nets, absolutely not. But they didn't have fishing hooks or anything. And so like the idea was like, maybe they wait until like, the dry season, the hot season, when the river gets really low and just grab the fish out of the water. And it was super cool to see no fishing like materials at all being found, but a bunch of fish bones being found that looked like they had, either been broken by a human or had marks on them that shows that they were being cut by humans and by stone tools. So it really, really depends much less on like the part of the world you are in, but the specific site that you're at, the history of that site, which I mean, most of these sites are known for like decades and decades. Like the site that I worked at in Spain is in the backyard of like the Spanish poet, right? And people knew about this site forever, but nobody went and excavated it. And so like we know about these things. We have an idea of what's going to be at the site, what idea we're trying to test. Because in science, you're always trying to test your hypothesis. You're always trying to disprove your hypothesis, right? And if you can disprove your hypothesis, that means your hypothesis is wrong and it needs to be restructured. But if you cannot disprove your hypothesis, then that means that it is supported by the evidence, right? Not correct necessarily, but supported by the evidence that we have so far. And so you're going out there with this idea of testing your hypothesis against the things that you find to be able to confirm or deny, or I guess support or not support how well that hypothesis is able to predict other things that you will find in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it's, yeah, it like you said, it also makes sense that when you go, for example, to Ethiopia, and you're looking at a period of time that was a lot less recent than say other areas you've excavated in, and then you find these fish bones that are a lot less I guess
they're less flashy,
or
like
yeah.
people don't like to hear about. And so this is part of the reason why I think education, this is going to be controversial, but why I think education is more important than archaeology, and why it's more important to me, because the power of an anecdote is like so much more than the power of data. Like, for example, I can sit here and I can tell you about this really cool hypothesis about people leaving Ethiopia, all of these fish bones that we found, the lack of other kinds of, fishing materials that we found there. And maybe you'll remember that, right? You might remember that for a few minutes. Or I can tell you about the site that I was in. Actually, no, we'll stay at the same site. Or I can tell you about like in Ethiopia when we're like uncovering a layer and we find leaf imprints, which doesn't really give us any information about the hypothesis we're trying to test, but it's just cool. And like it's just cool, and like it's a sexy idea, and like people want to hear about it, and like, oh my god, like leaves, like those things go away in like a few months, they fall off the trees, like they're gone. But we have imprints that are almost 100,000 years old at this site, at the same site where we have all this boring stuff. And so like this is where the gears in my head started to turn, where if what I want to do is put positive value into the world, right? The best way for me to do that is not necessarily to work with these, these tiny fish bones and get upset when people don't get excited about them. It might be to teach people about the leaves and the site and get them interested in something, and they can choose if they want to explore it more later. That to me feels a lot more engaging and like rewarding than working with like giant data sets for like a general public who just doesn't care about it, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess for fish bones, it's like you said, it's not something that's particularly flashy, or that's something that someone's gonna make. You always see these YouTube videos, for example, where it's like, oh, they found this in this
Yeah.
part of the world, and you're like, wow. And then they say, oh, we found fish bones in Ethiopia. It's not that big of a
And it's
headline,
like,
right?
oh my god, like that's amazing, like whatever, like it's only exciting if you're like a part of the research, if you really care about the hypothesis, but you can't get people
Right.
really like the common person has all of these things going around in their lives, and that's something that academics, that archaeologists, but especially academics forget, is that people have lives, right? Like you're in grad school and you're like expected to dedicate your life towards the field, but that's not how the majority of people work. Like they go to work, they leave their work there at the end of the day, they go home, they relax, they do it again the next day. Like as an academic, as an archaeologist, you are expected to live and breathe the field.
Yeah.
And so there's like often a disconnect between being able to communicate these ideas, right? And so like, yeah, exactly like you said, like fish bones are not flashy or exciting unless you know all of this stuff about the site and the research first. But how do you get people interested in that stuff? How do you get people to the point where they want to learn about these things? It's not by talking about the fish bones. It's by talking about the really cool stuff that you find that's less, quote unquote, scientifically, important. But again, like the power of an anecdote in these situations, like in science communication, is just like completely overwhelms the power of like large data sets. Human brains are just not built to work with data sets and numbers, but what we are really good at doing is like transmitting stories and like oral histories and traditions and stuff. And
Yeah.
so that to me is like so much more important than working on this data set that nobody is ever going to see or care about.
Right. I think it also comes down to kind of, you and I guess it is also in a way a question as to why you specifically chose the Paleolithic era. Because for example, me personally, I I'm very interested in Egypt and
Yeah.
the Egyptian pyramids and uh the period of time where the where the Egyptians kind of flourished and there was a big like society there and a big
Right.
culture there, big like I guess establishment. It was
Yeah.
a big place to be in, and so I'm very interested in that. And I've looked into several. It might be documentaries. Maybe I've read some things of things they've found there that they've excavated of
Right.
archaeological information and so on. And so if I were to get into the archaeology field, I would probably go into something like that.
Right.
Now, that in a way is, I think, more flashy than say fish
Yeah.
bones.
Definitely.
Why did you focus on the Paleolithic era?
For sure. So it really, a lot of it goes back to like archaeology being under this umbrella of anthropology. Because once you get into more recent time periods, right, like even though there's a lot of archaeology, it's not going to be classified as archaeology. So for example, Egypt, there's a whole field called Egyptology, which includes like a lot of archaeological methods where you go in and you do excavations and you do find these things, but Egyptology is its own field. And then you have people who study like Greeks and Romans, and those are like the classics. And then you have people who study East Asia, and you have people who study Southeast Asia, and all of these different things in more recent time periods that have so much nuance to them. It doesn't really make sense to throw them under anthropology. And so when I was converted to archaeology through an anthropology course, what I fell in love with was not the history, which I mean, I always loved as a kid. Like I loved watching like History Channel before it all turned into like Ice Road Truckers and Pawn Stars all day, right?
Yeah.
Like I loved like Indiana Jones when I was growing up, like all of this stuff. Um, but what really converted me was this anthropology class, and I just kind of fell in love with human evolution. The idea of like, let's figure out how humans evolved, which is a big hole in our knowledge. I mean, we have a pretty solid understanding of like what has happened, but there's still a ton of questions, things that like we will never know. Like, people often talk about like voice. What did other people sound like, in the past? That's something that we probably will never know. And there are like some really comical and awful attempts to like recreate what people could have sounded like. There was like a video on TikTok that was going around of like some like team of researchers who they like tried to recreate King Tut's voice, but they could only get like a single vowel out of it. It was like this like guttural, like like it was like this thing, and they were like, look, we did it, King Tut's voice, amazing. But something like that, we will just never know. So I really fell in love with the idea of like there are billions of humans all over the place, obviously, like we should be trying to learn more about how they evolved, right? Of course, not everybody believes in human evolution, which is fine. I don't think that religion and science are incompatible. I am religious. I'm a Jew. I'm religious myself. But I also still fully believe in everything that science says, right? So you can have this dichotomy. And so like when you start talking about human evolution, it's not taught in schools, like people don't have much exposure to it or interest to it. And so it is kind of like this mysterious thing. And so you're learning about like these species like Australopithecus or Paranthropus or like Ardipithecus, all of these like crazy hominins. A hominin is just like a really early human, or, you know, humans are hominins too. It's just a classification that we use for things that look a lot like humans, but aren't quite there yet. You hear about these things and they're like mysterious, and you know you want to learn more about it, but there's not much to learn more about it. And I think that's what drew me into the field of like Paleolithic archaeology. Is once you go far enough back in time and you start just looking at bones, you know, you excavate and just find fossils of like ancient humans from, we're talking like millions and millions of years ago. That's all there is. And so that falls under biological anthropology, right? So I got into Paleolithic archaeology because you're looking at a lot of bones of humans and stuff. The anatomy is still important, but at this point, what we care more about, we know a ton about their anatomy and evolution. What we care more about is their behavior, because that is one of the, like I always tell people, looking at a stone tool is like when you excavate and you find like a nice stone tool, it's very similar to like when you watch CSI and they like go to a dead person and pick up their phone and start going through it. It gives us the exact, you know, not the exact same information, obviously, but it's the exact same idea, right? Like we're going back. I mean, there's a very good reason why, like at this point in time, probably the most important object to humans is a smartphone. And going back 2 million years, the most important object to humans was a stone tool. There's a reason that they're both shaped the same. They're both approximately the same shape and size, because they're so important to us, because we need to carry them everywhere, right? It's these ideas and like being able to look back and uncover these things that are like super mysterious, but also like really important and relevant to every single human on this earth, that really pulled me into Paleolithic archaeology. That, and that I can still work with like, you know, actual artifacts instead of, you know, having to only work with bones and not really be an archaeologist. So that's kind of like what got me into, you know, that field.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It makes sense to hear what you're saying, because when, you know, when it comes to, I guess, excavating artifacts as opposed to say bones, you said.
Yeah.
So when you're studying anatomy, right? When we look at these Neanderthals or some other I guess species of prehistoric human.
Yeah, of hominins, right? That's the term that I was using earlier. They're all hominins.
Okay, so if we look at some, would you say species of hominins or just hominins?
Yeah, species of hominins.
Okay, so if we look at these species of hominins and we look at their bone remains, it's a lot easier to get an idea of their anatomy, how big they were, you know, what they were more or less shaped like.
Right.
But then, like you said, when it comes to behavior, when you look at these tools, I mean, that's really the only way to more or less get an idea of behavior.
It's the biggest way, but I won't say that it's the only way. So are you familiar with the fossil called Lucy?
No.
Okay, so Lucy is probably one of the most famous like paleoanthropological fossils that exists. She probably is the most famous individual one. She's in Ethiopia currently, I think. She was on tour like for a while. She was a Australopithecus afarensis is the name of the species, or Africanus, something, from around like 3.3 million years ago. And you know, we found her body. We were like, okay, this is cool anatomy. Can't really get much behavior because we don't have stone tools. A study from the team actually that I worked with when I was doing an excavation, completely different time period and like questions and everything in Ethiopia, but it was the same team that like made this discovery, was doing some like CT scans on Lucy and found breakage patterns. And not only did they look at the breakage patterns, but they were able to determine, well, they did do all of this by looking at the patterns of how the bones broke, but because by looking at those patterns, you can tell when you see bones if they broke before something died and then healed, if they broke at the time of death, which is called perimortem, or if they broke post-mortem, after death. So something dies and then whatever. Because if something breaks, and then heals, you're going to have a bone that looks a little wonky. If something breaks and then, or like if something dies and then the flesh goes away and you have these bones that remain and then that bone breaks, you're going to have pieces that go all over the place. But what they were able to do with Lucy, which was actually named after like the, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because that's what they were listening to and they found it in like the 60s. What they were able to do was look at these bones and figure out that, okay, they broke, but they didn't start to heal and the fragments aren't all over the place. So they were held together by flesh when they were broken. And they looked at what specific parts of the body had been broken and saw that she died from falling out of a tree. And so you can look at this anatomy and be like, okay, like the species that we're looking at has this, like, they have a lot of traits that chimpanzees have and a lot of other primates have that let them climb in trees. But humans are unique in that we walk bipedally, at least among primates, we're unique in that we habitually, obligately walk bipedally. And Lucy also had a bunch of those features too. So it was a big question of, were these features that are really good for climbing trees being used, or are they just carried over from evolution, kind of the way that we have a tailbone or an appendix? We're not using those parts anymore, but we still have them because there's no reason to get rid of them, right? But obviously, species like Lucy had reasons to get rid of these arboreal traits. Arboreal just means able to climb in a tree, because what they found was that she was climbing in a tree. She fell, I think it was like 20 or 30 meters or something like that out of the tree, broke a bunch of bones and then died. And so you can actually get behavior without looking at artifacts, just by looking at the bones. But it's a lot less informative than being able to look at a stone tool. And I mean, what some people will do, I went to school with crazy people who do this. They find like a hunk of rock and then a bunch of small rocks around them, and they fit them back together to figure out how people made the stone tools. So there you can actually see like the decision making that people are taking when they're going to make these stone tools. That is much more clear, like, I don't want to say more clear evidence of behavior, but it's much easier to analyze data like that when you're trying to think about behavior, as opposed to if you have no artifacts at all. But I won't say that it's impossible to find behavior if you don't have artifacts. You just have to look in a very creative way.
Okay. And is it just with bones, or is it possible with something else as well?
I mean, teeth, for sure. There's a site in Spain. It's a Neanderthal site in northwest Spain, I think. And the reason, there's a lot of these Neanderthal sites at the end of the Paleolithic when Neanderthals were going extinct in Spain, because it was pretty much the last refuge of Neanderthals, right? You have this not tiny, but you have this peninsula that's connected to Europe that is pretty isolated. And so they were able to survive there for a little bit longer. They also didn't have to worry about the world getting colder as much because it's closer to the equator and a little warm, right? So you have a lot of Neanderthal sites there. There's a site there, and teeth are like bones, but they're not bones, whatever. Really cool site over there in Spain, where they found a bunch of Neanderthals who had cavities, which is weird in itself because people didn't really start getting cavities until we started domesticating wheat. But the really cool thing was that they actually looked in the dental calculus, or what your dentist might call dental plaque, right? They looked in the plaque and found traces of poplar tree, which has anti-inflammatory and I think painkiller properties. And so what these Neanderthals were doing, and this is another example of behavior, they, had these cavities, or as like archaeologists like to call them, dental caries. They had these dental caries and it hurt. And so obviously what they were doing was chewing these poplar sticks to relieve some of that pain. There's another really, really, really cool site called Dmanisi. This one's also super famous. I don't know how I didn't think of this one for this example first. And what they got at Dmanisi, this is like, it's like 1.8 million years old. There they have really early, we are Homo sapiens, right? Homo is the name of the genus and sapiens is the name of the species. These are really early Homo. So they're still in the same genus as we are, but they're, very far separated from Homo sapiens or Neanderthals or any of the other Homo species that exist. What they have at that site, which is really early out of Africa, is like a group of people, and they're varying in sex and age. And one of them was like an older man, I think. And this older man had lost all of his teeth at one point. Um, but what was really interesting was that after he lost his teeth, the bones started to grow back over and heal. And so, like, imagine trying to live, almost 2 million years ago without teeth, right? Like, it would be difficult to do today. Like, there's a reason that,
Yeah.
like people who lose their teeth get replacements, or people have dentures, because it's so difficult to live without teeth. And the only thing that one can assume after finding something like that is that he had a community of people who cared about him, who were then helping him take care of himself until he died, but helping him take care of himself long enough after he lost his teeth for the bones to start to grow back and heal 1.8 million years ago. So that is a really great example of behavior that we have from just bones and teeth, where we can see the beginnings of human cooperation at like the scale that, starting to evolve to the scale that we have today, without looking at any artifacts or anything, just looking at the bones. But that's a really, really cool example that's like super famous. Like if you take an intro to archaeology, or like what ITA for is the intro to human evolution. Generally, if you take one of those classes, you're almost definitely going to be talking about that site.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I ever thought about how bones, teeth, and I guess things out of our anatomy could then
Yeah.
could be used to decipher the behavior of a certain
Yeah. Well, I mean,
species
like,
phenomenon.
for example, like, do you play any sports?
I used to. I used to play football.
Nice. Um, Football players actually use like the majority of their body, but for tennis players in particular, even something like that, like if a tennis player is right-handed, the bones in the right arm of their body are going to be thicker, because like those bones build themselves up because they undergo more stress over time. So like there are tons of ways. You can see diseases, which can tell you a lot about behavior. You can see things like that, like any like injuries, or the lack of injuries, for example, can tell you about behavior. So it's really, all about being creative in how you want to think about, like, how what you're looking at now, you dig something out of the ground, and it is your job to figure out how that thing got to the ground from, like, wherever it came from however long ago, figure out how it got there, and like what it can tell you about whoever owned it. Right. And so it's all
Yeah.
about coming up with these creative ways to kind of tackle that problem. That is really what I fell in love with about archaeology.
Yeah. Do bones grow thicker? For my knowledge, I thought, I mean, over time it makes sense. Like, let's say every single person on earth played tennis, and over time that side of the arm is going to grow bigger, right?
Yeah.
But if a person plays tennis, I wouldn't think that in their lifetime that bone would be thicker, but rather, let's say with UFC fighters, for example,
Right.
they kick so much that their shins kind of like build up these calluses and these bumps.
Yep.
In that sense, but I think that's from like overuse and injury.
That
That's
might be
just
from
preparing
actually
itself.
breaking the bone, right?
Yeah, like
No, your
these
bones,
micro
like,
tears in the bone.
yeah, exactly. Everyone has these ideas that like bones are like static, they're like rocks, they never change, but your bones are constantly changing throughout the course of your life. And so 100%, like that's one of the things that we teach our kids when we're learning about Neanderthals in when ITA Intro to Human Evolution, is we'll look at human bones, human leg bones in particular of the femur, and we'll look at Neanderthal leg bones at a cross section of them. And the Neanderthal ones are much thicker. And like one of the hypotheses as to why they're much thicker, not like just bigger, but like thick, like there's less hollow space on the inside for the marrow, is because they had to traverse more terrain. They were using their legs more. And so like you use these bones more and they get, much bigger. Arthritis is another thing that happens. Like you're using a bone a ton, and then like you've got some arthritis all of a sudden. And you're going to get arthritis in the parts of the body that you use the most. But the flip side is also true, where if you use these things a lot, they get strengthened. Like people will always say, like, if you don't want your hips to go bad by the time you're 60, like you need to do a lot of high impact, training, so that like your hips and knees don't go bad. The reason is because when you do that high impact training, the bones in your body actually do start to build themselves up and get thicker. And you can look at pictures of like tennis players, bodies of like x-rays, and the bones are visibly larger than the ones on the left side of their body, because over the course of their life, through thousands of hours of like using just those bones, their body recognized that like it has a higher likelihood of breaking unless it starts to like bulk up and like become a little more strong. So yeah, bones are like dynamic things that can tell you so much about the history of like whoever was using them when they were alive.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I thought that what makes I'm referring more so nowadays. I'm sure it was like this in the past as well, but what when a person is as they age and health issues tend to be more prominent,
Right.
what like kept you in a healthier shape was the support that your muscles give to your joints and to your bones, more so than like the thickness or the buildup
Hmm.
of bones themselves.
Yeah, and I mean it also, your muscles play a big part in that as well. And that's another thing that you can see how strong something's muscles are by there's like these little tiny, especially like towards the extremities, you have these like super tiny like bumps all over your bones, which are muscle attachment sites. And the reason
Okay.
that like the like bumps exist is because it provides more surface area for muscles to attach. And so when you have more of these bumps, it means that you had more muscle during that period of time. And so like, they might have bigger bones, the tennis players, in the arms that they were doing it, but they probably also have more muscle attachment sites, because these muscles are growing bigger and need more places to attach themselves to the actual bone, or else they're useless. Like I got a sprained ankle right now as we speak. The muscle is not attached to the bone. Like it doesn't work when it's not attached to the bone because it's a whole system of like counterbalances and weights and stuff. And so like the more of those sites that you have, the more stronger the muscle can get, right? The like bigger the bones will become to become stronger, and everything just kind of plays into itself to strengthen that part of the body that you're using a lot, which we can see in the
Yeah.
archaeological record and like get some information out of.
Yeah. Now these like these species of hominin and these Neanderthals, um, they were a lot more active than we currently are. They moved around a
That's
lot
an
more.
understatement.
They did a
Sometimes
lot of
like it's estimated that sometimes these people were walking like 10 to 15 miles a day
okay,
for
right. And
survival.
not only that, but they did a lot more physical and strenuous labor as
Yeah.
opposed to what we do right now. Now,
And no complex carbs.
now do these I'm assuming that these bones, when they're found, they have these distinct insertions for the muscle, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
because I am sure their muscle structure was different to what it is right now.
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
asking.
yeah, no, for sure.
Okay.
I by no means am an expert on this topic, but you would be surprised at how similar our bodies are to theirs while being different at the same time. I mean, they'll have like maybe more muscle attachment sites or something, but at the same time, like we all have the same number of bones, right? Like now humans are finally starting to lose their wisdom teeth. There are populations around the world who are beginning to evolve to not have wisdom teeth because, well, if you have wisdom teeth, like the reason our wisdom teeth are kind of so screwed up in the first place is because we started cooking food like anywhere between 300,000 and like a million years ago, maybe even before that, right? When you cook the food, it gets softer and you don't need to chew as much, and so our mouths got smaller and our whole heads got smaller, well, our whole mandibles, but our teeth did not. And so there are populations who are growing like these wisdom teeth, or have stopped growing the wisdom teeth because like the reason that we all have to get ours taken out is because they literally don't fit in our mouth anymore. And if you don't, you can get infected and you can die, right? So that is one difference that we have after 40,000 years of evolution after Neanderthals went extinct, right? But you would be surprised at how similar our bodies are. Back in like the mid 19th century, when people discovered Neanderthal bones, at first they found a skull, and everybody back then was like, oh my God, this is just a dumb human. Science back then was much more racialized, and so there were some conclusions drawn about races, which I'm not going to say here. But that was the interpretation of the time, right? But the similarities were like so extreme that people mistook Neanderthal skulls, which look, markedly different from ours. Like I'm an expert. Well, not an expert, but I've been doing this for a long time. And like I could easily look at a Neanderthal skull and a human skull and tell you which one is which, right? But back then people couldn't do that. And they just said that it was like a different thing of humans. And that's where you start to get the beginnings of ideas of races and ethnicities, is from looking at these things. And actually, like you can look at people, these like, people who have committed atrocities, like Hitler, for example, who used ideas directly from human evolution to justify a lot of what they were doing, who said like, I think he said it about the Jews, for example. He said the Jews are, less evolved than we, the Aryans, are, because look, their skulls are more similar to this one, right? And so like there are enough similarities between our bones and theirs to, mistake one for another, right? Also, you have to remember that when you're in the field and you're looking at these things, like 99.99999% of the time, you are never going to get a complete bone. It is usually going to be a fragment of a larger thing, which you will probably never see. We have thousands at every site that I've ever worked at, thousands of tiny, tiny, tiny bone fragments. And what they do is they go into a little bag and then they go into storage and then nobody ever looks at them again. And what one team at the Max Planck Research Institute in Germany did was they took all of these tiny bone fragments and they tested the DNA of them. And out of like 5,000 of them, they found a few that were human bones, which we never would have known were human bones because we don't have the whole thing. So if you want to look at something like muscle attachments in bones that you're analyzing, like good luck finding a bone that's complete enough for you to be able to do that. And even if you do, good luck being experienced enough and having the years of training that you need in order to be able to say what species that one thing of bone is from. And then if you can do that, good luck at being able to correctly interpret, what any of that actually means. So that's why, like, instead of just looking at the bones, just looking at the tools, just looking at this, an excavation will have experts from lots of different fields. They'll come in, all look at their thing, have these like big meetings and paint like a big picture of the actual site together, which hopefully can kind of be used to like weave into a larger story of what humans in general were doing at the time, which is where you get that distinction from like low level theory and how you can go upwards towards the higher level theory that people really, really care about.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you look at two bones, when you look at say a human bone, and then you look at a Neanderthal bone from millions of years ago,
right,
or a skull, it aside from I would imagine that, and you mentioned that bone thickness would be something that would suggest that it's from a like a prehistoric or an era that's not right now, that's older. What other signs could you look out for? What do you look like? What do you try to find in these bones?
Yeah, definitely. So it's really difficult to look at one thing in particular and ascribe that bone to a species. Like you couldn't hand me like one piece of bone and I can tell you exactly where it came from, right? You want to look at a bunch of different traits, but the most useful ones for telling you what a species is are the traits that only that species has, or what we call, like in this practice, unique derived traits. So traits that are derived from like the lineage that are unique to that one specific species. So for example, in humans, the chin, we are the only primate that has a chin. If you see a hominin, if you see something that has a chin, 100% chance that it's a human. We've got similar things with Neanderthals. There's this thing called an occipital bun. So your skull is separated into different like bones, basically. And the one in the back is called the occipital. And Neanderthals, I've got like a regular bun, but Neanderthals literally had like a piece of bone in the back about where my bun is sitting right now. And it's just a lot thicker. And that structure on the skull is called an occipital bun. And only Neanderthals have them. So if you find a skull that has an occipital bun, Neanderthals have them. Now, it's not always easy to tell whether or not it has one. So you can look at the shape of the brow ridge. Humans do not have one, but many other early hominins do. And so like Neanderthals, for example, have a straight one, whereas some of their closer relatives have a more, it's called heart-shaped brow ridge. there's this face, big word, called midfacial prognathism, which is basically, it's another thing that only Neanderthals have. And so prognathism is how much your face sticks out. So we have no prognathism. Our faces are very flat. But if you look at something like a baboon, they've got wild prognathism and their face is like all the way out. Neanderthals have prognathism only around their nose. And so when you look at a skull of a Neanderthal, it kind of goes down, it comes out around the nose, and then right back down to like being flat and then rounds off without having a chin. So that is very Neanderthal in itself. It's just looking for traits like that. Another thing that they have is called a retromolar gap, which is literally like you have your last molar here, and then this part of your mandible here called the ascending ramus. And there is a gap that's big enough for you to like maybe stick a pencil through between that last molar and this part of the bone here that Neanderthals have. Only Neanderthals have it, that humans do not have. So that's another way that it's these little things, you know, you have to learn like these like little signs on all of the bones to be able to tell you like the differences between the different species.
When do the first humans date to?
So for the longest time, it depends on your definition of human. So
because you mentioned you know, these Neanderthal bones, and then you mentioned these human bones. I just want to make the differentiate. Like I just want to be able to differentiate more or less what periods of time
yeah, for
these
sure.
bones pertain
No,
to.
it's a good point. I guess I didn't cover that. So Neanderthals lived probably, I would say around 400,000 years ago until around 40,000 years ago is when they went extinct. Humans, for the longest, and I'm talking anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, for the longest time, people thought that they evolved in Eastern Africa around Ethiopia and Kenya, around like 200,000 years ago, maybe a little bit older than that. But in the last few years, I say last few years, it's probably more like 5 or 6 years, they found a site called Jebel Yahud in Morocco, which has anatomically modern human Homo sapien remains dating back to around 300,000 years ago. So depending on who you believe is correct, humans have been around anywhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years, and Neanderthals first came around probably around 500,000 years ago.
Okay. And did Neanderthals have you said they had the same amount of bones as humans did?
We were so closely related that they interbred. So like
Oh, they interbred, okay.
You, like most non-African populations have Neanderthal DNA in them. And when you get like a 23andMe or like an Ancestry.com DNA test, one of the things it tells you is how much Neanderthal DNA you have inside of you. Because humans and Neanderthals were so closely related that they could reproduce and have like reproductively viable babies afterwards. That's literally how, like people say all the time, like we are 99.9% similar to like chimpanzees and bonobos.
Yeah.
We were even more similar than that to Neanderthals and this other species walking around in East Asia at the time called Denisovans. And so like if you look at like East Asians, they have a lot of what is called Denisovan DNA. And if you look at mainly European populations, non-African populations, they all have a ton of Neanderthal DNA in them.
Do primates have the same amount of bones that we do, or at what point did that change happen to where it's now the same amount of bones?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like all life has like pretty much all vertebral life has pretty much the same setup. We have a spinal column, we have a head area, we have like the end of the spinal column, whether it ends in a tail or not, and we've got 4 limbs. You can look at birds, and those limbs that they have, those wings, are the same bones that we have like in our hands, just modified and repurposed to become wings, right? And so I actually don't know. That's a good question. I don't know when, you know, we started to differentiate ourselves like skeletally in terms of like how many bones and bone structure. But then you can look at something like cats. Like cats don't have collarbones like we have, right? Like there are a lot of like adaptations. The whole thing goes back to like evolution. And that's why my degree is in evolutionary anthropology, because there's this like really famous quote that says like nothing in biology makes sense unless it's within the light of evolution. And so our field being a very biological field, you have to constantly be applying these evolutionary concepts to them in order for them to make sense. And so it could be very possible that you could have, all these species of hominins that have, the same amount of bones, which is kind of an arbitrary thing to look at in the first place, because that number does change over the course of your life, right? As bones fuse together and you get older. But you might have a branch that offshoots that has, a different number of bones, less or more, or something like that. And that's just because the environment that they like are in or were in had this what's called a selection pressure. So a pressure for something to evolve a solution to a problem. And a lot of times that solution to the problem takes the form of an adaptation, right? And so like, we have, I don't know, what's a weird adaptations, opposable thumbs. That is a problem that we had, right? Like a lot of primates have opposable thumbs, but ours are very dexterous. We were getting big brains. We were losing all of the hair on our bodies, at least relative to like other primates. And so like, you're kind of at a disadvantage there. Our jaw strength is not like as strong as like other, animals, definitely other primates, relative to the rest of your body. And so like the evolutionary response of humans was to come up with these dexterous hands that allow us to better manipulate our environment, which is where we started inventing tools, which is when we started inventing everything that, the computer that I'm talking to you on right now. Right. So it really is all very contextual. And when you're talking about like adaptations and like how bodies are different or similar, that is another thing where like you also have to consider the environment and the climate, because that is really going to determine how something evolves. Like you can look at something like sharks. Sharks have not had to change for like 500 million years. They really haven't had to. Their strategy works really well. Humans are doing really well because we're generalists as opposed to specialists. So we have a really great anatomy for being general, right? And now you hear people all the time saying, oh, we're stopping evolution with medicine, blah, blah, blah. We're not stopping evolution. That's not what we're doing at all. We're changing the trajectory of evolution by like allowing people who in the wild would not have lived long enough to have kids live long enough to have kids in today's world. But that's not stopping evolution. That's just changing the trajectory based on the environment, which is what life has done for, something a little bit over 1 billion years at this point.
Yeah. I mean, over time, probably we're going to get somewhat weaker, and then we're probably gonna get more intelligent, just because we were not as active as
That's
we
been the
used to be.
trend so far. Yeah, that's been the trend so far. We're also going to start to look more and more the same as like globalization becomes easier and easier to like, achieve a perfect version of, right? Where people are, I think, eventually going to lose their pinky toes is something people are talking about. It's really hard to predict what's going to happen because like a species, a life form has no reason to change evolutionarily unless its environment gives them a reason to. And there's, a long period of time in order for that to happen. Like we're talking thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, right? These things take a long time. So yeah, there's no reason for them to change. But going back to your original question, when you're thinking about like the differences between species like that, almost more important than thinking about the actual difference in what the species is looking at, why those differences started to come around in the first place. And that almost always goes back to climate and environment.
Yeah. Do current humans right now differ to the first Homo sapiens that were found, or in some ways are we different?
That's a good question. I mean, in a lot of ways, like we differ just among populations. Like that's one thing that I like to tell my students a lot is like we're all very different, but also all the same at the same time. So this is an idea that I still have trouble wrapping my head around, is that if you would think of like human variation as like a percentage, right? There's like a percentage of human variation. Like I am, 50% different from this person, or like, for example, I'm 50% similar to my sister because we share 50% of the same genes, right? If you think about all this human variation that exists, there is more variation within a group than between groups. So for example, there is more variation within a group of people living in the US and within a group of people living in, I don't know, Mongolia, then there is variation between those two groups. So we are more different than our neighbors than we are from the other people that like are on the other side of the world. And it's a really difficult and non-intuitive idea to like wrap your head around. But like we are like very different, very same in similar ways. A really cool one that I know of are climate, or not climate, altitude adaptations. And so like often like people, not often, people in Tibet do have adaptations, genetic differences from them and everybody else, that allow them to live at higher altitudes with less oxygen, right?
I'm from Mexico City, so whenever I tend to go to high altitude places, I'm usually fine.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Mexico City's high altitude, like you're used to it. Like you've got, exactly. And so like you have like, these people who have this adaptation, but then you have people in Africa who have an adaptation to be carriers of sickle cell anemia, because people who are carriers, which is, if you're familiar with genetics, there's the heterozygous form, which is like the recessive allele and the dominant allele, versus like homozygous recessive or dominant. If you are homozygous recessive for sickle cell anemia, like you're screwed. You have sickle cell anemia, like you're done. But if you're heterozygous, that means you're a carrier. You don't have many symptoms, so you can pass it on to your children. You will be able to have children because you will survive that long. But that also confers protection from malaria. And so that's why a lot of Black people in the US oftentimes will have like symptoms of anemia or like be anemic, because they carry this over from when, like they were living in Africa before they were literally stolen out of Africa and brought over there. When they were living over there, and that adaptation allowed them to survive, because malaria has killed more humans in human history than any other thing. It's malaria. It's one of the most dangerous things. I mean, we're doing pretty good at solving it. Like they have anti-malarials. They're not fun. You have wild dreams on anti-malarials. But they exist, right? But there were no anti-malarials like hundreds of thousands of years ago. So you have this adaptation that gives you some symptoms of sickle cell anemia. Not enough so that the sickle cell anemia kills you, but enough so that malaria does not kill you. But then 300 years ago, 400, 500 years ago, when, a bunch of Europeans went to Africa, stole all those people and brought them to the US, those adaptations aren't going anywhere. And so it doesn't really give you a benefit from malaria, but it also, still has some of those like symptoms of sickle cell anemia. And so those are just some of the ways that we're different. But then I also tell people like there are no biological markers for race. Like race is an entirely human construction. It's I'm sorry, like it's not real. I will say with the caveat, race is not biologically real, but the cultural creation of race as a cultural phenomenon is very real, and people have to deal with the consequences of that every single day, right? And so like you can look at the genetics of people and like it's the difference between like a Black person and a white person, or like an African and somebody living in like, I don't know, Siberia, are not that different. But humans have this mechanism in their brain which has helped them evolve and survive, that really is very good at like assigning whether somebody is in your group or out your group. So in group or out group. And like early on, like, around like the time of Enlightenment, maybe even before that, that was in like the mid like 18th, 19th century, something like that in Europe. Even before that, humans had this like awakening and they were like, those people are a lot different from me. They must be lesser because I'm here, I'm great, I'm awesome. They must be outside of my group. And so this is where so much of like the basis of racism is literally the human brain malfunctioning and like coming up with reasons to make people the out group solely based off skin color, because that's something that we're really good at seeing. But imagine if humans didn't care about skin color and we cared about something like blood type, which you can't see. Imagine if like, everybody who was like AB blood type in the US is like, treated like white people are, and they have all their like AB privilege. They have their white privilege. But then people who are like B or O type blood are, treated more like BIPOC people in the US today, and like they are marginalized and have all of these injustices happen to them throughout time and up to today, right? Like it seems very arbitrary to do it like that, and it is arbitrary to do it based on skin color as well. But it's just something that the human brain is just so good at recognizing, to the point where now we live in these giant societies, and a lot of times in a lot of people's brains it malfunctions. That whole instinct just works against, it's a maladaptation. It makes it harder for them to survive,
Yeah.
and so
I think
it
there's
works against those interests.
I think there's a couple of factors that come into play with these kinds of issues, and like
It's a
you covered
really
it pretty well.
complicated subject.
But for example, people have to people want to have a sense of belonging, and I'm sure that's been the case for thousands of years, right? And
Yeah,
so
of course.
we want
Why
to
do
have
you
a sense
think
of
people like
belonging.
invent culture? Why do you think people like practice religion a lot of times? Is to have that sense of belonging, right?
Yeah. And once you have that sense of belonging, I think humans tend to also have, and of course this plays a big role when it comes to a person's psychology and like the psychological factors of it, but I think people like to have control and power, and so
Yeah,
when you belong to this group and then you're able to um dominate another group
yeah,
somehow for some reason, right? Then people become um obsessed and enjoy having this power, and it's hard to deviate from it once you have it. And so
exactly. Yep.
I think that there's just a lot of psychological phenomena that play into these kinds of things, um and kind of our brains, the way they've been shaped, the way they've um been evolving, right, throughout
Right.
hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's totally true. And like, yeah, no, that's exactly right, right? Like, I think I've been saying it for a while. I think like two of the largest reasons why we have, so many racial, social, cultural injustices that we do, today, especially in the United States, is because of one, colonialism, and two, capitalism, which really drives colonialism to happen, right? Capitalism being this idea of like the free market or whatever, but realistically, what capitalism is in practice is doing everything you can to maximize profits, even at the expense of another. That drives the wheels of colonialism, which is we need to expand all. I mean, look at the British Empire at their height. They had their fingers in every single corner of the world, right? And then they left and they created these vacuums and they did these things. And like just like all human history, like it fell apart afterwards. Like people just like went and tried to fill a power vacuum. You can see this happening throughout human history, and it doesn't work. Like it just ends up being bad. And then like to make it worse, like you have like the British Museum. I have a big gripe with, because the British Museum, the British Royal Museum, should be like this awesome place, but they have all these stolen artifacts because of these places that they had colonized, and then they take these artifacts, bring them back, and now that we in the 21st century, in the year 2022, are like, okay, colonialism is bad, like that sucks. England is like, yeah, colonialism is bad, that sucks. So then, like we still have your artifacts. Like they have the Rosetta Stone currently at the British Museum. They have a ton of like all these artifacts, but the Rosetta Stone is something that like most people know, right? That was stolen from Egypt. It should be in Egypt. It belongs in Egypt to the Egyptians, but because of these things, like because of capitalism and colonialism, that like cycle of those two things is being perpetuated, right? And it really does all come back to like those two things, and humans having this outrageous instinct of in-group versus out-group.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to do everything we can to move away from these, so because of course there's good primitive tendencies and there's bad primitive tendencies. We need to
Yeah.
try to move away from these bad ones that kind of give us this negative um these negative psychological outlooks that make us feel superior over other people, when at the end of the day, like you said, we're all the same, and that should never be the case where one feels like they are superior to someone else. And I think we
Yeah,
need to
for
move away
sure.
from
Like,
that, and I think hopefully, and I do think that it's shifting more towards that than before. I think people are realizing this more and more and trying to make a change. And you now moving into education, you have the power to now be able to communicate this to more people and to um, affect these people in a positive way. Because of course, when you're growing up, that's when your brain is able to soak in the most amount of information, in the sense
Right.
that you're able to develop a certain way, right? Once you're older, it's harder to change your views, your perspectives, but when you're
Yeah, for
younger,
sure.
you can do that. And you moving towards that, you're going to have that power. And from what I could tell, you have a very good outlook on these things, and a very positive one, and I'm happy that that's something that you'll be able to do.
For sure. Like this just like brings it all back, right? Like if I were staying in archaeology and we were having the conversation strictly about archaeology or human evolution, like there's no room for us to talk about these topics. And even if there is, like a lot of people will try and bring these topics up in their research, even if there is, like you tell me what has had a greater effect on you, right? Like the hundreds, I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted right now because my cat just like flopped on the floor. She's being so cute.
No worries.
What like the thousands of hours of research that has been done, papers published, like giant databases that are out there, peer-reviewed journals, conferences, all of this stuff written in an academic language that most people do not understand and behind paywalls that most people cannot afford. Does that affect you more, or does this one conversation that we had have a greater effect on you? Right. And so that was the real reason why I think I like decided to transition out of archaeology, because as much as I love it, as passionate as I am about it and the material, like I can sit there and I can get all of the grants that I want. I can get all this money from the government. I can publish all of these papers, be a big name in the field, but it's a bubble. It's a huge bubble. And so like I'm writing all of these things and coming up with all these ideas, but who am I writing them to? Even if I'm like fooling myself into saying like, okay, like I'm doing this, research project for the people, it's going to be published in an academic journal, which you either need to pay like $75 to $100 to access the one article, or a couple $1,000s for a yearly subscription. And then once you get it, it's in all of this academic jargon, which you need years of education to understand. Or you could, be somebody like me, dumb it down a little bit, honestly, not even dumb it down, but like cut out all of the fluff, the stuff that like doesn't really need to be there in order to transmit the information, and then have, like, part of my French, have a fucking conversation with someone, like literally sit down face to face with your friend, like your students, like a classroom, whatever, and like just have a conversation with them about these things.
Yeah.
Like that has much more of an effect on culture, on society as a whole, than any amount of published papers, which academic people, and I don't want to bash it. Like, if you want to go into academia and do that, like, I respect that. I think everybody should be able to, and I think academia has its place. However, for me personally, like it wasn't worth it. There's always going to be a need for archaeologists and academics, and there's always going to be a need for teachers, right?
Yeah.
The important part is like figuring out where in that balance, like you want to sit, how you want to walk that line, and like where you want to go, what you want to do with it. And for me, like as important and cool as like all the archaeology is, it's literally conversations like this, which like get me up in the morning and like get me to go to work. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
that face to face like conversation that you can have with somebody where they walk away and you feel confident that like they took something out of the conversation, as opposed to just like publishing a paper and hoping that somebody read it and enjoyed it.
Right. And you're going to be teaching science, right? That's what you want?
Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah. And well,
We'll see.
is that what you want though?
I think so. I love
Okay.
chemistry. I'm a huge
Okay.
chemistry and biology nerd, but also like I would love to actually no, geology is what I really want to teach, but it's
Okay.
hard to find schools who want a
Well,
geology teacher.
right. But what I was going to say is, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to, hopefully, if that's something that you want to do, you're going to be still focusing on science, which
Yeah.
you've been involved in, and I'm sure you'll continue to be involved in, because I can tell that you're interested in that. That you are interested in and kind of fascinated by that.
Yeah.
I can see that you like that, those kinds of things. And that
It just
and your
gets me
field
going,
and your field of archaeology. And so I think that you being able to hopefully teach science, you'll be able to communicate the information, like you said, kind of cut out the bullshit, right?
Cut out the
And
cut out the middleman, cut out the bullshit.
stick to the information that you actually want to communicate. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you can teach younger people and your students, you can teach them. It doesn't necessarily have to be younger people, but just whoever's listening or whoever you want to
Just
teach, right?
your students, right? That's
You
how I
can,
like to refer to them.
right, your students. You can
Like I've got
teach
students
them.
when I teach labs, like I've got students that are high school students, like literally just taking college classes, and then like I've had students who are like 75.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
they're
So your
students.
students, you can teach them the science part of it, and then you can also teach them and like not necessarily teach them, but put in your view of these positive outlooks on society. And because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, these relate some way or another.
Yeah.
And so you'll be able to have that. And I think that's cool. And hopefully, if you do want to do that, I'm really wishing you the best and wishing that happens.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm gonna need all the like thoughts and prayers that I can get.
Yeah, no, I really do wish you all the best. And I think that's a good way to wrap it up, because
Cool. Yeah,
we've
sounds
covered
good.
a lot. We've covered a lot. We've covered not only the science aspect of it, but I think these society views that I think it's important that everyone
Yeah.
listens to and everyone kind of has a positive outlook on them.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree for sure. Yeah, it was a constructive conversation, definitely.
Yeah. But thank you. Thank you again for making time. Thank you for, you know, explaining everything thoroughly. I
Yeah,
really
no,
do
not a
wish you the
problem.
best.
Thanks for the interest, honestly. Like I was super. Can I ask like how you found me in the first place?
Yeah, so I was looking, there's different aspects that I'm interested in, different
Right.
fields, different topics.
Yeah, I was
And
checking out some of
so
the other episodes on your show. You just like get stuff that you're interested in and like bring in an expert and like talk to them about it. It's pretty cool.
exactly. So I looked into, I like history, and I was looking into uh the University of Minnesota's kind of like history and anthropology, and I found your
Nice.
profile, and I thought, hey, he looks like an interesting person. He looks like, yeah, like his research seems interesting, so I'm gonna reach out. That's how I found you. I pretty much just looked at the department and read your
For
profile.
sure, for sure. Yeah, cool. No, that's awesome. Yeah, well, I wish you the best of luck with the show. Like, seems like it's going places. You're good at what you do. You're good to hold a conversation about like,
Thank
you
you.
know, something that maybe you're not super knowledgeable about. Well, like you always get nervous because like people come on, like somebody will try and talk to me about archaeology, and like I always say at this point, they're like, you know, I'm like, oh, I'm an archaeologist, and everyone's like, oh, wow. But in reality, like it's just a really good party trick at this point. Like it's people don't know too much about it, and they don't necessarily always want to or like know how to have and like hold a conversation about it. So I definitely appreciate like your ability to like keep going. So yeah,
Thank you.
you keep
It's
trucking along like
practice.
that, your podcast's gonna be fine.
Thank you. It's practice. At the end of the day, like it's practice. It's the more you have these conversations with people, the more you're able to contribute towards them, not only from what you
Definitely.
know, but also to have a cue of how to, like, when to talk, when not to talk, what to
Yeah, like
say, what
what
not to say.
questions to ask, how to do it.
Exactly. You start to get a better idea of that as you do more and more of these types of conversations. And
For
it's
sure.
cool
Yeah.
not
Well, it
only
ain't easy, and I respect that.
yeah, what's cool about it also is it not only helps in these types of situations, but then if for whatever reason I need to talk to someone, in person
Yeah.
in my school or
Yeah.
wherever, right? It makes you practice those skills, it makes it easier.
Yeah, for sure. No, definitely.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you.
All right, awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.